The congressional hearing room descended into a heavy silence as Representative Jasmine Crockett rose from her chair, clutching a folder of neatly arranged documents. Across from her, Vivek Ramaswamy, the high-profile entrepreneur turned political figure, sat poised and assured, his confidence radiating across the chamber. Moments earlier, he had concluded a 20-minute statement that left much of the committee visibly unsettled. A performance filled with eloquent critiques, sharp data points, and cutting attacks on what he called the suffocating hand of government interference. Ramaswamy leaned casually toward his microphone, that signature half-smile crossing his face. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his tone both courteous and smug, "I welcome your questions, though I suspect they won't resolve the deeper philosophical flaws in this legislation." A faint murmur rippled through the room. The tension was palpable. Crockett's expression remained measured, her movements deliberate. She stepped forward, placed a single sheet of paper on the table before her, and spoke in an even, unwavering voice. "Mr. Ramaswamy," she began, her gaze fixed directly on him, "what I hold in my hand is your company's confidential application for the very government subsidies you've just spent 20 minutes denouncing. Signed by you personally, 3 months ago." The air seemed to leave the room. Ramaswamy's confident expression stiffened, his practiced composure cracking for the briefest instant. Across the dais, committee members exchanged startled glances. Reporters in the press gallery leaned forward, pens flying across notepads. Cameras zoomed in on the single sheet now lying between them, a document that, in a matter of seconds, had upended the narrative of the day. What followed would not only silence Ramaswamy, but would ignite a national debate about corporate hypocrisy and political credibility. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary confrontation, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more defining moments in modern American politics. Jasmine Crockett's rise in Washington had not been accidental. A former civil rights attorney with a law degree from the University of Houston, she had built her reputation brick by brick, through discipline, intellect, and an unwavering commitment to accountability. At 42, she stood out in Congress not for theatrics, but for precision. Where others sought viral clips, Crockett sought truth. "I don't care about viral moments," she once told a journalist. "I care about transparency, and the American people's right to it." Her relentless focus on corporate influence had made her both respected and feared. She didn't throw accusations, she proved them, armed with documents, timelines, and data points few could dispute. Over her tenure, she had quietly exposed several cases where powerful executives had said one thing publicly, while doing the opposite behind closed doors. On the other side of the ideological divide stood Vivek Ramaswamy, emblem of a new generation of corporate intellectuals turned political disruptors. At 38, the biotech prodigy had amassed a fortune through Roivant Sciences, then catapulted himself into the national spotlight as an outspoken critic of what he dubbed woke capitalism. His best-selling book, Woke, Inc. had turned him into a darling of conservative media. Articulate, sharp, and quick to dismantle government policies with the polish of a practiced debater. But beneath the polish lay contradictions Crockett had learned to spot instinctively. Their clash had been brewing for months. Two figures embodying opposing worldviews. Crockett, the lawyer of facts and fairness. Ramaswamy, the entrepreneur of ideology and free markets. The hearing that finally brought them face-to-face concerned the Innovation and Competition Act, H.R. 4672, a bill designed to strengthen American manufacturing through targeted subsidies and tax incentives. Ramaswamy had been invited by Republican members to testify against the bill, portraying it as yet another case of government picking winners and losers. What neither the public nor most committee members knew was that Crockett had uncovered a contradiction buried deep in the paperwork. Ramaswamy's own company had quietly applied for federal subsidies under a nearly identical program just months earlier. That discovery would soon turn a routine hearing into a political earthquake. Chairman Johnson called the session to order. The air in the chamber buzzed with anticipation. "Today," he announced, "we continue our discussion of H.R. 4672, the Innovation and Competition Act. Our first witness is Mr. Vivek Ramaswamy." Ramaswamy walked to the witness table with practiced ease, adjusting his tie as cameras followed his every move. His opening remarks were textbook perfection, polished, confident, and calculated for sound bites. "This legislation," he began, "embodies precisely what has stifled American innovation for decades. Rather than liberating entrepreneurs through deregulation, it builds yet another bureaucratic maze of subsidies that will benefit the connected, not the creative." He spoke like a man utterly convinced of his own argument. For 20 minutes, he dismantled the bill with numbers, history, and rhetorical flair. When the government decides who wins, the taxpayer always loses, he concluded to nods from several Republican committee members. Chairman Johnson thanked him and opened the floor for questions. When it was Jasmine Crockett's turn, she began in a tone so calm it disarmed the room. "Mr. Ramaswamy," she said, "thank you for your passionate defense of free market principles. You spoke eloquently about what you called corporate welfare." Ramaswamy inclined his head slightly, pleased by what he assumed was agreement. "Indeed, Congresswoman, it's a principle I've been consistent on throughout my career." "Consistency," Crockett said evenly, "is something I value deeply as well. I'd like to explore yours today, if you're willing." "By all means," he replied with his trademark confidence. Crockett glanced at her notes. "You founded Roivant Sciences in 2014, correct?" "Yes," he replied smoothly. "Built it into one of the leading biotech innovators in the country." "And you served as CEO until 2021, when you stepped back to pursue political work, though you remain a major shareholder and board member?" "That's correct," he said, his voice still steady, though his eyes flickered briefly toward her documents. Crockett continued, "Then you're likely familiar with the Pharmaceutical Research Investment Program, introduced under the previous administration." Ramaswamy hesitated slightly. "I'm aware of such programs in general, yes. This one," Crockett clarified, "provides up to $50 million in federal matching funds for research into emerging infectious diseases. Would you consider that a form of corporate subsidy?" He paused, considering his words. "In principle, any program that redirects taxpayer money to private industry demands scrutiny. But context matters." "Context," Crockett echoed with a faint smile. "Agreed. Let's discuss that." She lifted a document from her folder and held it up so the cameras could see. "This," she said, "is Form TR-7-2000, an application to that very program, submitted by Roivant Sciences on January 12th of this year, requesting $42.6 million in federal funds for antiviral research." The room went utterly still. "The application," she continued, "is signed by you, Mr. Ramaswamy, just 3 months after your Wall Street Journal op-ed calling such programs legalized bribery that corrupts the free market." Ramaswamy opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett didn't pause. "On page 4, she said, flipping through the document, "your own projections estimate a 340% return on investment if government funding is approved. The following paragraph states, quote, without this funding, the research would be financially unfeasible under current market conditions." She lowered the paper and looked directly at him. "Mr. Ramaswamy, how do you reconcile your condemnation of government handouts with your company's explicit request for those same handouts, signed by you personally, just 3 months ago?" The chamber fell completely silent. Ramaswamy's confident demeanor visibly faltered. "That application was submitted by the current management team," he began, his voice less assured. "While I remain on the board, I'm not involved in day-to-day operations." Crockett held up the document again. "Your signature appears on page 12, dated January 12th of this year. Were you not CEO at that time?" "I was transitioning out of Therol," Ramaswamy countered, his tone growing defensive. "According to SEC filings," Crockett continued, producing another document, "your official transition date was February 28th. The application was submitted during your tenure as CEO with your signature under your authority. Is that correct?" Ramaswamy paused, visibly calculating his response. "Technically, yes, but additionally," Crockett continued, "I have here the minutes from Roivant's board meeting on December 17th of last year, obtained through a FOIA request related to another matter." She held up another document. "These minutes indicate that you personally directed the executive team to, quote, aggressively pursue all available government funding opportunities despite our public position on subsidies." Gasps echoed through the chamber. A reporter from the Washington Post was already typing frantically on his phone. "Those minutes are taken out of context," Ramaswamy objected, his voice rising slightly. "We were discussing a comprehensive funding strategy." "I'm not questioning your company's right to apply for legal funding programs," Crockett clarified. "I'm questioning the consistency between your private actions and your public testimony. You've presented yourself as a principled opponent of government subsidies, while simultaneously seeking those exact subsidies for your own financial benefit." She leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Ramaswamy, do you believe the American people deserve consistency between a public figure's stated principles and their private actions?" The question hung in the air. Committee members from both parties watched intently, the partisan divide momentarily bridged by collective interest in Ramaswamy's response. Of course, consistency matters, he finally answered, his voice regaining some composure. But business decisions are complex. Sometimes you have to operate within the system that exists, while advocating for changes to that system. A fair point, Crockett acknowledged. But then wouldn't intellectual honesty require that you disclose your own company's participation in these programs when testifying about their merits? Before Ramaswamy could answer, Crockett continued, "Let me ask directly, did you disclose to this committee that while you were publicly condemning government subsidies as corporate welfare, your company was actively seeking those same subsidies?" "I was not asked specifically about it's a yes or no question, Mr. Ramaswamy." After a moment's hesitation, he answered, "No, I did not disclose that the admission lingered in the air." Chairman Johnson, sensing the shift in momentum, intervened. "The gentleman's time has expired. We'll take a brief recess." Before continuing, as committee members filed out, reporters hurried from the room, already crafting headlines about the exchange. Ramaswamy remained seated, consulting urgently with his legal team, his customary confidence notably absent when the hearing resumed after 15-minute recess. The energy in the room had transformed. What had begun as a routine committee session was now being live-streamed by every major news network. Social media was erupting with clips of Crockett's questioning, and reporters who had initially skipped the hearing were rushing to secure seats. Chairman Johnson, recognizing the heightened scrutiny, adopted a more formal tone. "The committee will come to order. Representative Crockett, you may continue your questioning." Crockett nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman." She turned back to Ramaswamy, who had used the recess to compose himself, though his earlier bravado remained subdued. "Mr. Ramaswamy, I'd like to clarify that my concern isn't with Royan Science supplying for legal government programs. My concern is with the contradiction between your public condemnation of these programs and your private pursuit of them. Would you agree there's a discrepancy there?" Ramaswamy had clearly prepared his response during the recess. "Congresswoman, I acknowledge that on the surface, there appears to be a contradiction. However, business leaders often have to make practical decisions within existing frameworks while advocating for systemic change, just as many climate activists still fly on airplanes." "I appreciate the analogy," Crockett interrupted, "but there's a critical difference. Those climate activists don't testify before Congress condemning air travel without disclosing their own flight history." She picked up another document. "This brings me to your CNN interview from February 3rd, where you stated, and I quote, 'I have never and would never seek government handouts for my businesses. That's a matter of principle for me.'" She looked up. "Was that statement accurate, Mr. Ramaswamy?" The room fell silent again. Ramaswamy's legal counsel whispered something urgently in his ear, but he waved them off. "In retrospect, that statement was overly broad," he conceded, his voice strained. "Would false be a more accurate description?" Crockett pressed. After a long pause, Ramaswamy answered, "In the strict sense, yes, that statement was incorrect." The admission sent another ripple through the chamber. A senior economic correspondent from Bloomberg was seen texting frantically on his phone. "Thank you for that clarification," Crockett said, her tone remaining professional rather than triumphant. "I have one final line of questioning. In your opening statement today, you said that government subsidy programs inevitably benefit the well-connected over true innovators. Given that your company sought $42.6 million from such a program, were you classifying Royan Sciences as one of the well-connected or as a true innovator?" The question, perfectly framing Ramaswamy's dilemma, caused a few committee members to suppress smiles. Answer one way, and he'd admit his company wasn't innovative. Answer the other, and he'd contradict his central argument against the legislation. Ramaswamy visibly struggled with the question. "That's an oversimplification of a complex. It's your own classification system," Mr. Ramaswamy, Crockett noted. "I'm simply asking which category your company falls into according to your own definition." After several seconds, Ramaswamy offered his response. "Royan Sciences is absolutely an innovative company. Our pursuit of available funding doesn't change that." "So, you would agree that innovative companies can appropriately benefit from well-designed government programs?" Crockett asked. "In certain limited circumstances, yes," Ramaswamy admitted, effectively undermining his earlier blanket condemnation. "One last question," Crockett said, gathering her documents. "You've written extensively about corporate transparency and integrity. Do you believe that public figures should disclose potential conflicts between their public advocacy and their private business interests when testifying before Congress?" Ramaswamy, recognizing the trap but seeing no way around it, responded, "Yes, transparency is important." "Thank you, Mr. Ramaswamy," Crockett concluded. "I appreciate your candor." She turned to the chairman. "Yield back the remainder of my time." The impact was immediate. As Crockett concluded her questioning, phones throughout the chamber lit up with notifications. The exchange was already trending nationwide with number Ramaswamy contradiction and number Crockett receipts becoming the top hashtags on multiple platforms. What made the moment particularly powerful wasn't merely the gotcha revelation. It was Crockett's methodical fact-based approach. She hadn't engaged in personal attacks or partisan rhetoric. She had simply presented documented evidence of a clear contradiction between Ramaswamy's public stance and private actions. As the hearing continued, other committee members attempted to follow Crockett's line of questioning. But the decisive moment had already passed. Ramaswamy, normally eloquent and quick-witted, gave increasingly brief, cautious answers. His earlier confidence thoroughly diminished. When Chairman Johnson finally adjourned the session, reporters swarmed Crockett as she exited the chamber. "Representative Crockett, was this an intentional trap for Mr. Ramaswamy?" One shouted over the others. Crockett paused briefly. "This wasn't about setting traps. This was about ensuring that testimony before Congress is complete and accurate. The American people deserve to know when there's daylight between what public figures say and what they actually do." As she continued down the hallway, Ramaswamy emerged from the chamber surrounded by his legal team. The contrast was stark. Crockett walking confidently alone, Ramaswamy huddled with advisors, his expression tense. A senior congressional correspondent who had witnessed hundreds of hearings remarked to a colleague, "That wasn't just a political moment. That was a masterclass in oversight. No grandstanding, no partisan attacks, just methodical exposure of hypocrisy through documented evidence." By evening, the video of Crockett's questioning had been viewed over 7 million times. Political commentators across the spectrum were dissecting the exchange, with even conservative outlets acknowledging the effectiveness of Crockett's approach. "Whether you agree with her politics or not," said a prominent conservative host in his evening broadcast, "you have to respect Representative Crockett's preparation and precision. She didn't attack Ramaswamy's ideas. She exposed a contradiction that he himself couldn't explain away." The days following the Crockett-Ramaswamy confrontation saw a seismic shift in the national conversation about corporate influence in politics. What began as a routine committee hearing had evolved into a watershed moment that transcended partisan divides. Within 24 hours, major newspapers ran front-page stories with headlines like "Double Standard, Ramaswamy's public stance contradicted by private actions, and Crockett's questioning exposes gap between rhetoric and reality." The Washington Post published a detailed timeline juxtaposing Ramaswamy's now public statements against his company's private actions, revealing a pattern of contradiction dating back several years. Ramaswamy initially attempted damage control, releasing a statement that characterized the contradiction as an unfortunate oversight and disclosure. This explanation failed to gain traction when journalists uncovered additional instances of similar discrepancies. 3 days after the hearing, he appeared on Fox News to offer a more substantive response. "I acknowledge that my testimony should have included full disclosure of my company's applications for government programs," he conceded, looking uncomfortable. "While I stand by my broader concerns about government overreach, I should have been more transparent about my own involvement in the current system." The interviewer, normally sympathetic to Ramaswamy, pressed him, "But isn't that exactly the problem Representative Crockett identified? You condemned as corporate welfare the very programs your company was actively pursuing." His strained response, "It's complicated," quickly became a meme across social media platforms. For Crockett, the aftermath brought national recognition beyond anything she'd experienced previously. She had entered Congress as a relatively unknown freshman representative. Now she was being hailed as the embodiment of substantive oversight in an era often dominated by partisan theatrics. What made Representative Crockett's questioning so effective wasn't partisan anger or gotcha politics, explained a political science professor on CNN. It was her lawyer's approach, methodical, evidence-based, and focused on a clear contradiction. She didn't need to editorialize because the facts spoke for themselves. Major publications requested interviews, which Crockett granted selectively. When asked about her preparation, she explained, "I approached this like any other hearing, with thorough research and a commitment to facts." The American people deserve representatives who do their homework. The impact extended beyond media coverage. 2 weeks after the hearing, the House Ethics Committee announced new disclosure requirements for all witnesses testifying before congressional committees. The Crockett Rule, as it became informally known, required explicit disclosure of any business interests directly related to the legislation under consideration. The chairman of the Ethics Committee explained, "Regardless of political affiliation, we can all agree that testimony before Congress should include full disclosure of relevant business interests." Representative Crockett's questioning highlighted a gap in our current process that this rule addresses. Even more significantly, the Innovation and Competition Act, the legislation that had been the subject of the hearing, underwent substantive revisions. Rather than abandoning the subsidy approach Ramaswamy had criticized, legislators from both parties worked to strengthen accountability measures and transparency requirements for companies receiving funds. "We're not eliminating subsidies that can strengthen American innovation," explained the bill's Republican co-sponsor. "We're ensuring that those receiving taxpayer funds can't simultaneously condemn the very programs they benefit from." For ordinary Americans, the confrontation offered a rare moment of clarity in an often confusing political landscape. A retired teacher in Michigan expressed what many felt: "I'm not an expert on economic policy, but I understand when someone says one thing and does another." Representative Crockett showed us exactly that without yelling or name-calling. We need more of that kind of accountability. The exchange also sparked a broader conversation about their relationship between business leaders and public policy. Op-eds and editorial boards across the country examined the Ramaswamy contradiction, as it came to be called, the tendency of business leaders to condemn government intervention while privately benefiting from it. "The issue isn't whether government should or shouldn't support private industry," wrote a respected economist in The Atlantic. "The issue is transparency and consistency between public statements and private actions." Representative Crockett exposed a hypocrisy that transcends this specific case. For Ramaswamy personally, the confrontation marked a turning point. After initially attempting to downplay the contradiction, he eventually published a lengthy essay acknowledging the inconsistency and reflecting on the challenges of transitioning from business to public advocacy. "I still believe in limited government," he wrote, "but I recognize now that principled advocacy requires complete transparency about one's own participation in the systems being criticized. I failed to meet that standard, and for that I apologize." Crockett's response to Ramaswamy's essay demonstrated the professionalism that had characterized her approach from the beginning. "I appreciate Mr. Ramaswamy's reflection," she said when asked about it during a television interview. "This was never about personal attacks. It was about ensuring that congressional testimony provides a complete picture to the American people." 3 years later, the Crockett-Ramaswamy exchange was being taught in law schools and public policy programs as a case study in effective oversight and the importance of consistency between public advocacy and private actions. What had begun as a seemingly routine congressional hearing had become a defining moment in the ongoing national conversation about integrity in public discourse. As a senior political analyst observed on the Adabu third anniversary of the confrontation, what makes the Crockett-Ramaswamy exchange endure isn't just the gotcha moment. It's that it changed how we think about the responsibilities of those who testify before Congress. Before that hearing, disclosure of such contradictions was considered optional. After Crockett's questioning, it became essential. For her part, Crockett continued her work with the same methodical commitment to facts and institutional integrity that had defined that historic day. When asked years later about the confrontation's legacy, she responded with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Mr. Ramaswamy and I disagree on many policy questions, and that's as it should be in a democracy," she said. "But what we established that day transcends those disagreements. The principle that our public discourse depends on honesty and transparency. That's not a partisan value. It's an American one." If you found this analysis of political accountability valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of today's most important confrontations. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on corporate transparency in politics.